So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody from various parts of the world. It's really a pleasure to have this webinar on a very important topic. I think this is the world is facing very relevant to the global warming situation, and we're really glad to have Lucas Henneman from George Mason University join us. Dr. Henneman is an assistant professor in environmental engineering at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. He studies relationships between air pollution, emissions resources, air quality, human exposure, including inequities, and human health. His recent work involves developing and applying models that enable exposure studies of large numbers of individual air pollution sources. Prior to this current position, Dr. Henneman completed a postdoc at Harvard School of Public Health and earned his PhD prior to that at Georgia Tech. So thank you so much, Lucas, for taking the time, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. It's a really wide body of experts from all different fields, from what I gather, and so this is going to be a bit of a specific talk on some work we did, looking at power plants in the United States, and really it overwhelmingly I think it's a success story that has a real hopeful ending, but then also some lessons learned, and we can hopefully there's a lot to take away here from different people, and really I think just sort of skipping maybe to the end here is that this work, we published it in Science, the big part of it, and it got a lot of press, basically saying, and one of our big takeaways and the big headlines was, okay, coal is bad for you. Coal killed a lot of people in the United States, and to some people this might be kind of obvious on the one hand, but what I hope to show today is that we took a really rigorous approach to this, and we actually learned some things about the ways that coal is bad for us that is different than before, and learned some things about what the US did well as it sought to control emissions from coal power plants, and some of the things that it maybe hasn't done so well and could still address moving forward. So since this is a multidisciplinary group, I thought I would start with a quick overview of air pollution and what causes it. And so the way we think about the atmosphere is that we wouldn't have anything in the atmosphere without emissions. And so emissions can come from, say, power plants. They can come from, power plants, for example. They can come from cars. They can come from trucks. Even trees emit chemical species that can be considered air pollution. And each of the different sources here emits pollution at different timescales in different locations. They emit different species. They emit on different timescales. So a power plant might turn on at the beginning of the week, run for 5 days, and then shut down for the weekend, for example. Car emissions are coming out more during rush hour, more during the week, less on the weekend. Trees are really dependent on, when the sun is shining. And there are many other sources. These are just 4 examples. Now, those emissions enter the atmosphere, and then they start to interact with meteorology. So wind can take the pollution one direction. Solar energy can cause chemical reactions. Clouds, water in the atmosphere has their own influence on atmospheric chemistry. And then eventually, after all of this, they deposit out to the ground level. And some pollutants stay in the atmosphere for longer, some pollutants deposit out more quickly. And the last major process that influences atmospheric or atmospheric concentration of pollutants is chemistry. So there's all kinds of things going on. You know, I'll be testing you all on these chemical reactions at the end. No, I'm just kidding. But these chemical reactions are going on and converting pollutants from one thing to another. And that's either potentially making them even more harmful or less harmful than they were when they were originally emitted. And there are sort of two major categories of pollutants that we worry about most in terms of their health impacts. And that's ozone, which is a gas, and we won't talk that much about ozone. What we're mostly going to be talking about is particulate matter. So you may have heard of PM 2.5. This is particles less than 2.5 microns in diameter. And I say we're worried about these, and the biggest reason that we're worried about them is because they're bad for our health. And you know, there's actually been a lot of evidence over thousands of years that air pollution is bad for health. So this is Roman Seneca the Younger, a philosopher and the teacher of Emperor Nero, who said, but I've been consigned, so to speak, to one specific ailment, meaning asthma, who indeed could breathe his last for so long. And then there's other text about how he would leave the city and his health would be improved because the air quality would be improved. So, you know, we've had sort of empirical evidence that air pollution is bad for a really long time. In the last few decades, with the improvement of measurements and the improvement of epidemiological methods, we've really honed in on just how bad air pollution is. So this is the maybe the most famous plot in air pollution epidemiology from a study called the Harvard 6-City Study. So what they did was they looked at death rates in 6 cities in the United States. Each one is represented by its first letter here. And they looked at the concentration of PM 2.5 in these cities and compared that against the likelihood that a person living in that city would die in a given year. And the baseline is P, and the name is escaping me. This is Steubenville, Ohio. Had the highest concentrations, and then relative to the cleanest city had the highest rate of death. And from this study and many others following it, the US has developed a pretty robust regulatory program on PM 2.5. And, you know, using results from this study and other studies, there are results from, say, the global burden of disease that estimate that PM 2.5 outdoors is linked with about 4 million deaths worldwide each year. So that's deaths that occurred earlier than what the person would have lived to if they hadn't been exposed to PM 2.5. And this is you know, good evidence and good starting place for our study. And I just want to introduce a little bit more about what PM 2.5 is. So here's an image, sorry it's a little small, from EPA, showing the size of PM 2.5 relative to a human hair. That's this long piece here. And then these bigger circles are PM10, so 10 microns, and then PM 2.5, you know, there are like 30 PM 2.5 widths in a human hair. And so we regulate them and we classify them by size. These are solid or liquid particles. There's coarse particles below 10 microns, fine particles below 2.5 microns. And there's some physical basis for this. If you look at how deeply these particles penetrate. So the bigger particles tend to get stuck, more in the throat or just before the lung, and the PM 2.5 can penetrate all the way into the lung, and then maybe even finer particles can penetrate even further. But this metric, PM 2.5, ignores any differences in chemistry, chemical composition of these particles. It's only a size categorization. And so we pose the question, we know these particles are made up of different chemicals. Is that chemical composition, or the source that it oriented from, more important for health? And also, if we're regulating the sources to begin with, so we might write rules for power plants, does it make sense to understand the health burden from the sources that we regulate more specifically than sort of broad brush? What is the total burden of all particulate matter? Okay, so that's background, and that brings us to coal power plants. And why study coal power plants? Well, historically in the US, they were a major source of air pollution. So in 2005, power plants accounted for 12% of primary PM 2.5 emissions, 16% of NOx emissions. This is another regulated air pollutant. And 70% of all US SO2 emissions came from coal power plants in 2005. So these were a major source category. And previous attempts to do what we are trying to do, look at the mortality from coal power plants, found really big numbers. So in 2005, from this study in Nature, they estimated 24,000 deaths in the US from coal power plants. That number came way down in 2018 to 8,500. And you can see this time series plot here on the right. But the assumptions made by these previous studies, we thought could be improved. So for one, they used health risks for their study, and they inferred them from previous epidemiology studies. So they didn't look at the population in the US and look at how bad coal was for them and then estimate the number of deaths. They sort of used historical data on relationships between PM 2.5 and mortality. And second, they just made the assumption I was talking about before, where all PM 2.5 is equally bad for you, and didn't consider that PM 2.5 from power plants might be more or less toxic than other sources. So we wanted to improve on that. And so then we asked 3 questions, and those 3 questions, just for some background data, this is all the coal power plants in the US in 2005. You can see most of them are on the East Coast, especially along the Ohio River Valley here. And that's where most of the biggest ones, so the biggest ones are the orange dots here. And those emissions from those power plants have decreased a lot since 1999. So this is another time series plot, where there were about 1 million tons of emissions in 1999, and then by 2020, it was down about 90% relative to 1999. And so we had 3 questions about this that we wanted to ask. One, what led to reduced SO2 emissions and exposure from coal power plants? So what caused the trend that we see on the bottom left? 2 is an equity question. How have air pollution exposure inequities changed with SO2 emissions reductions? Has everyone in the US benefited similarly due to these reductions? And 3, how's the health burden changed with SO2 emissions reductions? And so I'll start with the first question here. What led to the reduced SO2 emissions? Well, the first way to answer this is to just look at the coal power plants that were operating in the US. So in 1999, there were just over 1,000 electricity generating units. That number increased slightly, and then there hasn't been a new coal power plant built in the US since 2015. So this is just the total number. And then we can see the number operating without emissions control. So a SO2 scrubber started decreasing in 2008. The numbers operating with a scrubber started increasing. And then along the way, there were some retirements. So that's what's in green here. And there's sort of two major trends. One is between 2006 and 2011. The utilities were installing a lot of scrubbers. And then after 2012, many of these units started to retire. And the major reason for that is that natural gas became price competitive with coal around that time. Now, we didn't want to just look at the numbers of units. We actually wanted to look at, okay, who was breathing in the emissions from these facilities. And to do that, we developed a modeling approach based on this high split model. High split is a transport and dispersion model. So you can see two examples on the left from a facility in Georgia. In February and July, you can see the different dispersion patterns that are based on which direction the wind's blowing and how hard it's blowing. And so we ran this model for each of the facilities 4 times per day across 22 years. We were interested in the SO2 emissions because SO2 contributes to PM 2.5. And then we used, the output of this relatively simple model. We compared it to a more complex model that we only had model runs for one of the years and estimated the contribution from each unit to PM 2.5. We called this coal PM 2.5. And so what we could get if we just look at like a year of data from this facility on the Illinois-Indiana border is a dispersion pattern and exposure pattern from that facility. So this addresses who's exposed to the emissions from this facility. Okay. And so we do this for every facility, and we end up with a time series of exposure in each year. So here's a time series. 1999 is on the left again, and 2020. And these are box plots. So each year's distribution of coal PM 2.5 exposure across the entire US. And you can see again, we have sort of elevated exposure until about 2007, sometimes up to 10 micrograms per meter cubed. The US standard, by the way, is 12 micrograms per meter cubed. So if 10 micrograms per meter cubed is coming from coal, that's already getting you most of the way to not meeting the standard. And then after that, there's this decrease. After 2007, there's a decrease. And spatially, it looks like this, where the East Coast is really getting hit hard. This is where most of the facilities are. And the contributions from coal power plants are decreasing across time. Okay, so then we can use this data, since we have the contributions from each facility, to try to address why the concentrations were changing. And I did it using a plot that looks like this. So bear with me for a second. This is time on the x-axis, again, starting at 1999, going to 2020. And then the y-axis here is, you can think about it as the contribution from each of these different categories that I'm going to describe. So you have contribution for starters. This is the dark gray. The biggest contribution to exposure at the beginning of the period is coming from facilities without an emissions control, so no SO2 scrubber on these facilities, and they're contributing most of the exposure early on. You have some contribution from facilities that with a scrubber, so they're much cleaner, they have much lower emissions, so they have much lower contribution to exposure. Then as the time passes, you start to get some exposure avoided. So that's the dark blue. And the exposure avoided can be avoided before you install a scrubber. So if you retire a very dirty plant, or even if you retire a relatively clean plant that already has a scrubber, you get a small benefit from that. And that benefit's pretty small. And in the big middle here, the biggest reason that the exposure changed over this period is from the installation of scrubbers. And then there's some benefit for reduced operation, either before you install a scrubber or after you install a scrubber. And basically, there are three major periods here that stand out to me. One is between 2006 and 2011. That's when many of the facilities were installing scrubbers. That's where we were getting the biggest benefit during that period. 2008, you remember, was the Great Recession. And so that's that reduced operations chunk here. Electricity demand in the US fell during this period. And just by switching off the coal power plants more frequently, we ended up reducing exposure. And then especially after 2012, we see this benefit start to come in of retirements. And again, that was because of decreased price of natural gas. Okay, so that was the first question. What led to the SO2 emissions reductions and exposure reductions? So the next question was, okay, we know there were reductions. How well did these accrue equitably across the US? So this is, sort of from an environmental justice lens. And to do this, we had our exposure from the first question, and we gathered county level US population, which is relatively coarse, but as you saw in our exposure, the exposure field is pretty regional. So we felt that we are capturing the relevant exposure disparities using county level population. And just from a national perspective, it looks like this, where the population weighted average for the total US is these dots. And then for most of the population groups nationwide, they're actually exposed at levels less than the population average, but the Black population is exposed to higher levels almost throughout the entire time series. But the nationwide analysis probably leaves out some finer points here that we wanted to look at. So we looked at the inequities from exposure in different regions. So in the Northeast, the Black and white populations here, so these are time series, and on the vertical axis here is the relative disparity. So the relative to the population average, and here the Black and white populations are about at the population average. And looking at facilities in three more regions. So the South, the story was Black populations historically were exposed at higher levels to power plants. After those emissions controls and retirements, that's when you started to see the inequity decrease among the Black population. Now, in the North Central, so this is mostly the Midwest of the US, those retirements really didn't have an influence on the inequity. Black population is still being exposed more. Similarly, in the West, where the concentrations are relatively low, but you still have coal power plants, and here it's the Native American populations who are being exposed at higher levels and continue to be. And we can drill down even further to look at the individual states that the facility's in and which populations they contribute inequitably to. So the Black population, for example, you can see this wide swath, especially in the Northeast. And okay, so here you have 1999 on the top and 2020. So we expect a big change between the years, but we don't always see that. For example, in the Native population in the Southwest, there are some big coal plants out there that didn't retire by 2019 or didn't retire by 2020 and still contribute to this exposure inequity. Okay, moving along. This is the last piece then. So how's the health burden changed with SO2 emissions reductions? And just to remind you again about the change in concentrations, contributions of coal power plants to PM 2.5, sort of around 2 micrograms per meter cubed, the median until 2007, and then major decreases after that. And spatially, we had lower concentrations in the West generally than in the East, and then decreases in 2013 and 2020. These are just snapshot years. So we wanted to link this data to a large health data set that we had access to. And so we used the Medicare health record. So this is everyone who's on Medicare in the United States. We had data from 1999 to 2016. These are annual records. So we knew where people lived, and we knew where they died, and we were using which zip code they lived in. This is an older population. It's 65 years old and older. And the data set ended up being really big. So we had over 650 million person years in this data set, and 32.5 million deaths recorded. And so to link the information in this data with our exposure, we used a stratified Poisson model. The details are here, stratified by follow-up year. We had information, some individual information, but also controlled for zip code covariates like weather, region, and year. And the goal here, I'm an engineer. I spent a little bit of time in a public health school of public health, but I really didn't want to innovate on this part. And so I used a model that had been used with this exact same data, so by Zhao Wu, used with this exact same data, but instead of looking at coal PM 2.5, Zhao was looking at total PM 2.5. And I'll show you the differences in our results soon. But the point is this model is well vetted and very appropriate for the type of question we were trying to answer. And so the result of this model looks like this. The biggest outcome is one number and then a confidence interval. What we're showing here is the mortality relative risk per 1 microgram increase in PM 2.5. So essentially, you can interpret this as anyone exposed or the average person exposed to 1 more microgram per meter cubed of PM 2.5 from coal, their risk of death increases by 1.5%. And the important comparison here, I thought, was comparing this value to similar results that have been found from total PM 2.5. So these are essentially what get used to do calculations when the US sets its regulatory standards. And what we found is that the relative risk, the risk of dying from coal PM 2.5 was about 2 times the risk from total PM 2.5. And this was sort of surprising, although not so surprising that we didn't believe it. But just because these total PM 2.5 relative risks get used so widely, and they get used for all different kinds of PM 2.5, and just to find this one that is that much more harmful was kind of an interesting finding. To cross I's and cross T's and dot I's, we did a lot of sensitivity analysis. We adjusted for other pollutants like PM 2.5 from other sources, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, all of which are regulated by EPA for their health impacts. We looked at just subsets of the study period and got consistent results. Instead of using just our model-based coal PM 2.5, we did some adjusting based on observations of sulfate PM 2.5, which should be related. We used different statistical model setups, and kept finding consistent results, one after another, and so that made us more confident in the results that we got. Okay, so then with the result from this Poisson regression model, we wanted to go another step further, and that was to estimate the total number of deaths, or the deaths each year from coal power plants. And this is the equation. It's maybe too in the weeds here. We could just show the results. On the plot here, we have the time series again from 1999 to 2020. And then on the y-axis is the annual excess deaths, so additional deaths from coal power plants that we see that would have been there, or that would not have happened had there not been coal power plants. And this shaded area on the top is the results from our study. So what we found over the course of the period is coal is related to 460,000 deaths across the whole period. And again, you see this pattern where they stay high until about 2007, and then there's this major decrease because of scrubbers and retirements. Now, if we had used the traditional way of doing this, and use the other relationships between total PM 2.5 and health, we would have found numbers that were about half of what we've calculated. So this again was sort of a big finding that coal has contributed twice as many deaths as we might otherwise have thought using these old methods. Now we had the contribution from each facility, and we were able to calculate that based on our exposure. And so here what you're seeing is on the x-axis, each of these bars going out to the right represents a single power plant. And on the y-axis is the total number of deaths from each power plant. And some of the largest ones are labeled here, so the biggest being the Keystone facility in Pennsylvania. And they're grouped on the y-axis by the region that they're in. And there are a few takeaways here. One is that the colors of the bars, so the warmer colors like yellow and orange represent the early time period, so 1999 to 2010. And the cooler colors represent later time period. And most of the area of this graph is taken up with these warmer colors. So most of the deaths contributed from each of the facilities is from that early time period. And then only a small fraction, when the emissions were reduced, are from the later period. The other takeaway is that they're really not even distributions. So there are some major power plants here that are contributing a large fraction of the overall mortality. And we can look at the individual facilities and how interventions at these facilities have reduced the number of deaths. So the Bowen facility in Georgia was one of the largest emitters early on. We were linking it to upwards of 750 deaths per year, and then even as high as over 1,000. That facility installed scrubbers on its 4 units in 2008, 2009 time period, and you can see this major drop in deaths contributed by that facility. And another example, the EC Gaston facility in Alabama had, between about 500 deaths up to 600, then installed a scrubber, and its deaths decreased after that. And so this came out again, and we, got a fair amount of press for it, and that was exciting. And I think being able to sort of get the word out there that, not only was coal bad, but it was twice as bad as what we might have thought, was a really important outcome from this. And one of the reasons that I'm in this field is to try to influence policy. And I was sort of excited that of all the sort of attention that it got, one of the biggest sort of promoters of the work was John Kerry, actually, who spoke at COP28 on Health Day. And unfortunately, I think I didn't set it up so that I can play this audio, but actually let me try.
You can stop sharing, and then when you reshare, there's an option for you to have the sound and showing up. We'll try that.
Okay, let's try this. I tried that. Thanks.
There's a study that just came out the
other
day.
Good.
My
Great.
daughter, Vanessa, who has the privilege of working with Dr. Tedros, repeats to me frequently that we should not measure progress on the climate crisis just by the degrees averted, but by the lives saved. And the fact is that there's a new study by George Mason and by the Chan School at Harvard, which underscores that coal is, in fact, doubles the number of deaths over the other sources of air-carried pollution. And coal is about PM 2.5. When you measure the PM 2.5, it's double for coal. Now, we don't need that necessarily to tell us we ought to be transitioning out of coal. There shouldn't be any more coal-fired power plants permitted anywhere in the world. That's how you can do something for health. And the reality is that we're not doing it. So, the measure here is really sounding the alarm bell. I find myself getting more and more militant because I do not understand how adults who are in position of responsibility can be avoiding responsibility for taking away those things that are killing people on a daily basis. And the reality is that the climate crisis and the health crisis are one and the same, totally connected, totally converging at this moment in time.
Okay, and so that was sort of a big moment for me personally, I think, just to hear, this on this major platform. Thanks.
Well
to hear them say George Mason, first of all, and then, but to use our study to make this major call for not building any more coal power plants. So John Kerry is I think recently retired as the U.S. climate envoy, but maybe his words will live on. So with that's the end of my story here. I just want to make sure before we have questions, I didn't do all of this alone, of course. I worked with really great people. At one point, we were all or most of us were in Boston. I was there I was at Harvard School of Public Health for my postdoc. But many of us have kind of gone all over the world now. And Munshi Razel is my student, my graduate student here, and has helped a lot with this work. And then the others are sort of all over. But certainly without their contributions, this wouldn't have happened. So with that, I'll finish up, say thank you again for having me, and happy to discuss anything. Happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Lucas. What a fascinating research work that very clearly comes to some conclusions. And hopefully we all listen to them and do something about it, right? As a policymakers. It's good, very good. Feels good that to hear some good piece of research. So let us open it up for discussion. Any questions, comments from the folks out here? Just either raise your hand or just unmute yourself. I think you can take off the slides. Maybe just that way we can encourage more interaction. Because you stop sharing the screen unless somebody wants to see some data. But if we stop sharing, and then we can encourage more discussion. So just raise your hands or just unmute yourself and jump right in. Okay. We have about 30 people here, so potential. Yeah, sure.
I see questions in the chat, so I could
Go,
start
please,
with
yeah,
those.
please keep going. Yeah, please keep working on that. Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
From Priscilla, thanks for the question. So, a question about if the dust settling on leaves of trees is harmful or not. Well, it could be. So, in some urban areas, you see sort of a dark dust settling on leaves, and that could be the same type of thing that we're breathing, and that could be harmful. And then I see another question here from Anil Kumar. What are the development attempted to capture all emissions and use it beneficially? So I guess this is a nice lead in to one point that I'm talking about SO2 emissions in particular. So that's sulfur dioxide, which is very different than CO2 emissions that also comes from these coal power plants. And so we weren't looking at the climate impacts at all. And I know there are ongoing attempts to capture CO2 emissions and either bury it or use it to create liquid fuels, but that's not what I'm doing here. When the SO2 emissions are captured, there's not much we can do with the sulfur that's beneficial. It essentially they're removed from the emission stream, and then we have to figure out what to do with the SO2.
Yeah, that's an interesting second question.
Yeah. Developing mucus lining on the inner surface of nostril trap. It could, although the issue with PM 2.5, so this is just 2.5 microns, and those particles are small enough to, for the most part, bypass the defenses that are in your mouth and throat and pass all the way into the lungs. And so that ends up being the real worry about these small particles, that they're able to penetrate so deeply.
Okay. Other comments, questions?
Krishna, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Okay. Thank you kindly for this wonderful presentation. I guess one of the questions I have, in particular, given the presence of many colleagues and friends from India, are you in contact with colleagues outside of the United States that look at some comparative data, how this impacts this critical issue, obviously India and other countries? Any thoughts on that, dear Lucas?
Yeah, I motivate this often by saying that there are other countries in the world who are or other areas where there, emissions from coal don't look, the pattern doesn't look like what it looks like in the US. And I don't know specifically in India what the situation of or what the status of coal use and coal emissions are. I know globally the International Energy Agency expects coal use to continue to grow over the next few years and hopefully peak in the next few years. But it remains to be seen if we're actually able to achieve that. I also know I'm a part of a panel right now that's sort of advising or hopes to advise as India looks at its sort of first major air pollution regulation, where they're comparing the changes from the next few years against 5 years ago. And most of that comparison is just looking at, total PM 2.5, but I know there have started to be real efforts in India to reduce air pollution.
Great. A couple more questions have been on the chat. Do you want to take a look at those, Lucas?
Yeah, so SO2 emissions and the use of scrubbing devices to remove them, any power plants using clean coal technologies to reduce emissions, as their scope for using them. So I think, scrubbers that I was calling them, one of the terms being thrown around, especially in the period where the US was installing a lot of scrubbers, was sort of clean coal. And there's a few different ways to describe what clean coal is. Another would be removing sulfur from the coal before you burn it, or choosing coal that has less sulfur. So I think those are all technologies that are, sort of under that clean coal umbrella. What I would say is that based on our results, there's really no such thing as clean coal. It's if you're emitting SO2 from your coal power plant, which even the most stringent technologies are doing, you're still contributing to this measure of coal PM 2.5. You're still leading to negative health impacts. Yeah, duration that PM 2.5 stays in the air and how far these particles can travel. So a reasonable estimate is about a week, from when particles are emitted to when they eventually either get rained out or deposit on their own. 1 week is a reasonable guess, and actually for our modeling here, that's what we assumed. Although there can be some variability if between a very short amount of time to up to a few weeks. Let's see. So Amit, thanks. Yeah, good information there. In India, we have increased pace of installation of renewable, but a lot still comes from thermal.
Lucas, how far they can travel? Okay, those 2.5 particles, how far they can travel?
Let's see. It's a few thousand kilometers at least, yeah. And it like, one example, we periodically have events on the east coast of the US where dust is agitated up from and transported this way from the Sahara in Africa. So these things can travel really far if they get high enough in the atmosphere.
Okay, there's one last comment question from Johannes from South Africa.
So do not have scrubbers. IUCEE is currently bypassing the scrubbers. Wow, yeah. I was lucky enough to spend 3 months in Bloemfontein in my PhD studies, and had a really great visit to South Africa and did a little bit of studying the coal power plants there. Unfortunately, that was like 10 years ago, and I haven't been in contact with people there, but I would love to be in contact and you know, help share at least what I've found in the US here.
Okay, so that's pretty much good interaction from our audience. Hans, you want to bring it to closure?
Thank you kindly. Thank you, Lucas, for your very, very thoughtful. Talking about South Africa, I work closely with the South African community. Our former GEDC chair, Professor Sunil from Pretoria, and others, without going to details. And I will certainly share the recording of your presentation, as Krishna and I do with our global community. But let me just totally switch and thank you, of course, and just want to, representing, as you know, IFEES and GEDC, and we work in close friendship and partnership with IUCEE and Krishna and his team. Just want to let you know that we will be meeting IFEES GEDC representation during the ASEE forthcoming meeting in Portland, Oregon this June. We'll have a session on climate change in addition to peace engineering per se. And without going to details, I'm very pleased again to many friends and colleagues coming together. I'm also very pleased I'm in final discussion. I was recently there in Serbia. We have a regional conference in Serbia in the Balkan regions in Europe this late October per se, bringing together engineering leaders, but also government and others together at that time. And the critical on an annual basis, as several of you know, we have our annual WEEF Global Conference in Sydney, Australia. As co-chair, I work closely with our colleagues there, an exciting program in a very special city of the world. And just finally, I'm very pleased we are making wonderful progress on our 5th edition of Rising to the Top, written by women engineering leaders globally, focusing on the Arab world and Southeast Asia. And we hope within the next couple of months, this will come. We'll be able to complete that. So with that, on behalf of our team, Krishna and his team, Lucas, thank you for a very, very thoughtful presentation. I look forward. I'm also at George Mason University, so we definitely need to connect, a very special place just outside of Washington, D.C. And I appreciate your thoughtful contribution to this dialogue here, dear Lucas. Krishna?
And thank you all for joining us, and have a good day, good evening, good night. And
peace be with you.
Peace be with you, right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.